Hello and welcome to Wigan and Leigh College's Maths Revision session. Now today's 25th of April and we will be looking at Pythagoras theorem. I'm just going to wait for a few more of you to join on and then we will get started. Okay, well, Pythagoras theorem, it is a theory that's based on right-angled triangles, and we use this to find the missing length of a triangle. Now, you do usually have the other two sides, and you use them to work out the third and the missing length. Now, before we do start off with the revision session today, there's a few simple points or basic points that we do need to be confident with to be able to progress and succeed with Pythagoras theorem. Now, first of all, we need to be able to identify the hypotenuse, which is one of the lengths of a triangle, and I'm just going to show you how we would do that. Now, the hypotenuse, it is first of all, we know that it's the longest side of a triangle, but because the pictures in the exams are usually not drawn to scale, sometimes it's not that obvious, so we do need to be able to identify it via another method, and that is that it's always opposite the right angle. So this length over here is the hypotenuse, and we know that because it's the one that's opposite the right angle, so it's worth making note of this. Okay, so the hypotenuse is the longest side, and we can identify it by seeing that it's the one that's directly opposite the right angle. Now, what I do want to do is just have a look at a few examples just to make sure that we are very confident with this. Okay, so let's draw a couple of triangles and let's discuss where we think the hypotenuse might be. Okay, so on this first triangle over here, you can see this is this little corner here. It shows us that that's a right angle, which is 90 degrees. Let's write down right angle. Okay, and the side directly opposite is this length over here. So that would be the hypotenuse. Okay, and for this triangle over here, this is our right angle, and the side directly opposite would be the hypotenuse, which is this yellow line over here. I'm just going to label that H. And for this third triangle, again, this is the right angle, so the side directly opposite is this length over here, highlighted in yellow. Okay, now that we've established how to identify the hypotenuse, I want to look at this theory in a little bit more detail. Okay, now Pythagoras theorem, it can actually be written in one short equation, and that is a squared plus b squared is c squared. Okay, let's have a look at what that actually means. Okay, and like I said, this theory only works with right-angled triangles. Now, first of all, we do need to be able to identify the longest side. I did refer to that as the hypotenuse in C, but according to this theory, the longest side is always referred to as C, so I'm going to label this C. A and B are the other two sides, or the other shorter sides. It doesn't matter which one you label A or B, as that won't make a difference. They will both still be the shorter sides in comparison to the longest side. Okay, now this theory just means length A squared plus length B squared will give us the length c squared. Pythagoras did say that in a right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the square of the other two sides, which is what we're looking at. Now, I am going to give you some examples that we can work on, and you can make a note as we go along. It will really help you to make sure you are confident with this topic. Okay, so for the first example, let's draw a triangle. I'm going to label two of the lengths, and the one I've not labelled is the one opposite the right angle. So this is length C, it's the longest side. Now we can label for the sake of labelling if you want the other two sides. It doesn't matter, like I said, which one's which. So we've got one as A and one as B. Now according to the theory, it's A squared plus B squared is C squared. Okay, so A squared would be 3 squared. B squared is 4. Well, B is 4. So B squared would be 4 squared. And that should give us C squared. Now, 3 squared just means 3 times 3, which is 9. 4 squared means 4 times 4, which is 16. And the sum of that will give us C squared. 9 at 16 is 25, which is C squared. Now, we don't want C squared, we actually want just C. So the inverse of a squared number is the square root of that number. So what we're going to do to cancel out the square is square root on the other side. So we're going to square root the 25, which will give us C. Now, the square root of a number is, like I've just said, it's the inverse of a squared number. So we're looking for a number that if we times it by itself, it gives us 25. Now, that will be 5. So now we know that length C is actually 5. 3 squared plus 4 squared is C squared. Now we know that 9 and 16 is 25, and when we've square rooted that, it is 5. So this is right. Let's just have a look at a quick, another example very quickly. Okay, now the next example that we will be looking at today, let's draw this triangle out for you. Actually, the triangle could be drawn in any direction, so it doesn't need to be like the other one. Let's have a look at this one that we're going to do. So I'm going to call this X, this length C, and this length 8. Now let's just look again at the hypotenuse. Now, like we said, it's the one opposite the right angle. So the length that we're trying to find, X, is really our C, isn't it? And it's the longest side. So again, for this, we're going to use the same theory, which is A squared plus B squared is C squared. Like I said earlier, the other two sides that are the shorter sides, it doesn't matter which one is A and which one is B. You can just label them as you please, as long as we know that C is the longest side, and that we've called X. So let's just put in these values and work out this calculation. I always, out of a habit, I always work with the bigger number first. So, because the bigger number on the short side is 8, I'm always going to square the 8 first. And I will come to that a little bit later as to why I do that. It will make it easier for when we're looking for one of the shorter sides. Okay, so 8 squared plus 6 squared is, well, in this case we've called it X, haven't we? In the exams or in any questions that you might do, it won't be referred to as C, it could be X, Y, Z. So you need to get used to be able to identify the hypotenuse and adapt yourself. So 8 squared again is 8 times 8, which is 64. 6 squared is 6 times 6, which is 36, and that will give us X squared. Now 64 add 36 is 100, which is c squared, and to get the inverse, well, to cancel out the square because we want c on its own, we do the inverse, which is the square root of 100. And the square root of 100 is a number multiplied by itself that will give us 100, and that we know is 10. So we know that the length x, well, I've called it c again, haven't I? Sorry about that. The length x is actually 10. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put on an example or two, and I want you to have a go at them. I will go through the answers with you. I'll give you about 3 minutes to just have a look at that and see how you can work with it. Okay, if you can just have a go at these two questions. So question 1 and question 2, and I'll give you about 3-4 minutes to work through that, and then we can go through the answers. Okay, not exactly 3 minutes, but I think that should be okay for me to start going through the answer with you. What I'm going to do is open up a new screen and we can look at the working. First of all, we'll have a look at the first triangle that I've drawn. So let's have a look at that again. So we had x, and it was 5 and length 12. Let's just label these centimetres, because in the exam it's more than likely that you will have units of measure that you will be working with. Because we're finding the longest side, which is opposite the right angle, we know that's c squared. So we're going to go with the formula a squared plus b squared is c squared. Like I said, with the shorter sides, any can be a or b. So it's 12 squared plus 5 squared which will give us x squared. 12 squared is 12 times 12, which is 144, and 5 squared is 5 times 5, which is 25, and that gives us x squared. Now the sum of 144 and 25 is 169. Now to get x on its own, we need to do the opposite of squaring it, which is the square root. And the square root of 169 is 13. So we know that the length here, x, is actually 13 centimetres. And always remember, in the exams, when you're actually given an answer, don't forget to add the unit of measure. It's very important to make sure you do add that, as otherwise you don't know 13 what, it could be 13 anything. Now I'm just going to have a look at the next example that we did as well. And this time we just called it y. So again, just to identify that opposite the right angle, we're finding the longest side. So it's a squared plus b squared is c squared, and it does not matter which way we do it. I'm just going to go 12 squared, which is one of the lengths, and the other one is 9. So 12 squared plus 9 squared will give us y squared. 12 squared is 12 times 12, which is 144. Have I done that before? And 9 squared is 9 times 9, which is 81. The sum of 144 plus 81 is 225. And to get y on its own, we'll do the opposite of squaring, which is the square root, or the inverse. So the square root of 225 will give us y, and the square root of 225 is 15. So we know that y is 15. Well done for those of you that have got that right, and if you haven't, don't worry, there's plenty more practice. Make sure you come to revision sessions which are on every day at between 4:30 and 5. Come to your tutors if you're not sure of the times, and we will give you more information on them. Okay, now that we've done looking at the longer side, what I want to do is look at how we would find the length of a triangle if we were actually looking at one of the shorter sides. Now the shorter sides, like I said, they're identified as obviously they're not the hypotenuse, so they're not the longest side, it's one of the other two sides. Let's have a look at working these out. So I'm going to draw a triangle. We know what the hypotenuse is, it's the one opposite the right angle, and I'm going to call this 12 metres. I don't know what this is. Let's just call this A, and we've got 6 metres. Now, Pythagoras' theory for the longest side said a squared plus b squared is c squared. But that is when c is the longest side. Now, it does make sense, doesn't it, that when something's getting longer, you're adding to it. So my theory is, if we're finding something that's shorter, we're going to be taking away. I want you to make a note of this and remind yourselves always. So when you're finding the shorter two sides, the calculation that you will be doing is take away, because we're going to be finding the smaller sides. Now, it doesn't matter if it's length A or length B. The fact that it's one of the shorter sides, we will take it away from the longest side to work that out. So, because we've called it A, if we wanted to find A, let's rearrange this formula like you would in algebra. A squared equals, it's c squared, and we're going to move the b squared over, and so it will become a minus, so it's a minus b squared. Now, if we were finding the other side, which is b, we'd be doing the same thing. So b squared is c squared minus a squared. Just give you a minute if you want to make a note of that. So when you're working out one of the shorter lengths, whichever two values you have, or two lengths you have, that's why I always said you always write down the biggest number that you've got. So the biggest is always the hypotenuse, which will be c. So in this case it'd be 12 squared minus 6 squared, which will give us a squared. Oh, I just got rid of my triangle. If you just give me a minute. We'd call that B. Okay, so the longest side is 12. We're going to... So it's 12 squared minus 6 squared, which will give us b squared. 12 squared is 12 times 12, which is 144, and 6 squared is 6 times 6, which is 36, which gives us b squared. Now 144 take away 36 leaves us with 108, which is b squared, and to get b on its own we are going to get the square root of 108, and the square root of 108 is 10.4 meters, and that's to 1 decimal place. Okay, and we have our length B. Let's just have another practice at getting the shorter side. Okay, so the hypotenuse, which is the length again opposite the right angle, is 20 centimeters. We want to find this length, and we know that this is 7 centimeters. The first thing you would do again is just identify whether you're finding the longest length or the shorter length. Now, because the longest is opposite the right angle, this is 20 centimeters, it means that we're finding one of the shorter lengths. So the calculation we will be doing is taken away. So let's square the numbers, which is always the first step. So it's 20 squared minus 7 squared, which will give us x squared. 20 squared is 400, 20 times 20, and 7 squared is 49, which is 7 times 7. 400 minus 49 is 351, which gives us x squared. And to get x on its own, we will square root 351, and that is 18.7 to 1 decimal place. Okay, what I'm going to do is just sum this up a little bit more for you. So let's just sum up what we've learned about Pythagoras' theorem. I like to put it down as 3 bullet points, and I really feel that it helps you to remember what you need to do when you've got 2 lengths of a triangle and you're trying to find the third length. The first thing that we've been doing in every single example is that we've squared both numbers that we have. Square it in order, so make sure you square the biggest number first, and then the second number. So I'm going to write down the first step for Pythagoras is square both numbers. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is we need to decide whether we're going to add or subtract the numbers that we have squared. Now, this is where our knowledge of the hypotenuse comes in. If we're trying to find the hypotenuse, which is the one opposite the right angle and it's the longest side, we will add the numbers squared together, so a squared plus b squared. And if we are finding one of the shortest sides, we will subtract the numbers, so it's c squared minus either a squared or b squared. The last step, which is very important, is to square root your answer. Now, you do have the button on your calculator that you can use for this, and this is a symbol that represents the square root, and we also have a button on the calculator to square a number, and I will show that shortly. if you'd just like to make a note of this summary, it will help you to remember this for the exam. So when we're looking at Pythagoras, and we're using two lengths of a triangle to find a third length, the first thing we do is square both numbers. We decide if we're going to add or subtract, depending on whether it's the longest side or the shorter side, and then finally we square root our answer. Now, because we've not had a practice on the shorter side, I will give you a question that you can have a go at, and I'm not going to tell you whether it's the longest side that you're finding or the shortest side. I will be expecting you to identify that yourself, and I want you to have a go at this just before we do sign off. Have a go at these two questions. Okay, I'll just go through the answer with you now. So let's have a look at this first question over here. Now what you should have done is identified that the length that we're finding is opposite the right angle, so it was the longest length. So the first thing we would have done is squared the numbers that we had. So it'd be 8 squared, 5 squared. In our summary, the next step was to decide whether we were going to add or subtract. Because it's the longest side, you would have added. And this will give us the x squared. So 8 squared is 64, add 5 squared, which is 25. 64 plus 25 is 89. Ignore that. That's supposed to be an 8. So that's 89, which is x squared. And to get x on its own, the final step would have been to square root the 89. And the square root of 89 is 9.4 to 1 decimal place. Okay, and I will just go through the next question as well. Okay, again, like we said, this is the second question. So, step 1, square both the numbers and always do the biggest number first. So it's 13 squared and 5 squared. Step 2, we need to decide whether we're going to add or subtract. Now let's look at what length we're finding. Well, the length opposite the hypotenuse is 13, so we already have that length, which means we're finding one of the smaller sides. So we will take away or subtract. Now 13 squared is 169. Again, 5 squared is 5 times 5, which is 25. 169 minus 25 is 144. And the final and a very important step is to square root the answer. And the square root of 144 is 12. So we know that the missing length is 12. It's the shorter side. We subtracted and square rooted. Okay. I would like to say a big thank you for visiting, and we will have more to come. If there are any questions, feel free to ask now. I will be more than happy to answer.